Imagine boarding a plane, dressed to impress, ready for an important journey only to be mistaken for someone who belongs nowhere near first class. This is the story of Aaliyah Morgan, a powerful CEO with a calm and quiet strength that hides a lifetime of resilience. On a seemingly ordinary flight, she was handed a dirty napkin, her phone shattered, and escorted away not because of what she did, but because of who she was. What happens when society's silent prejudices collide with dignity and determination? How does a single moment of injustice spark a movement that shakes an entire industry? Can silence be the loudest voice in a world desperate to hear the truth? This is not just a story about one woman's fight. It's a mirror reflecting the biases we all carry, the power of quiet resistance, and the revolution that begins when no one looks away. Are you ready to see beyond the surface? To question what you think you know about respect and power? Like, share, and subscribe to Silent Defenders to dive deep into stories that challenge, inspire, and change how we see the world. Now, let's begin. The airport buzzed quietly beneath the pale morning light. At John F. Kennedy International Airport, the usual hum of travelers and announcements drifted through the terminals. But at Gate 37A, the atmosphere felt different, a tension barely perceptible, like the subtle crackle before a storm. Aaliyah Morgan stepped onto the jet bridge with measured grace. Her eyes were calm, focused somewhere beyond the immediate chaos of boarding. Dressed in a simple yet elegant navy pantsuit, tailored to perfection, she carried only a small, sleek black carry-on that glided beside her with silent wheels. Her hair, naturally coiled, was pulled back into a neat bun that revealed the sharp lines of her jaw and the smooth curve of her neck. She did not rush. She never did. Every step was deliberate, a quiet declaration of purpose. As she approached the aircraft door, the subtle clack of her polished loafers seemed louder than usual, a steady rhythm against the white noise of murmured voices and rolling suitcases. Inside the first-class cabin, a soft glow illuminated cream leather seats and polished walnut panels. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and fresh flowers, a curated scent to soothe the nerves of the privileged few who would soon settle here. Two flight attendants stood by the curtain that separated first class from business. Clara Simmons, the lead flight attendant, adjusted her crisp white blouse with practiced precision. Her blue eyes scanned the cabin, then flicked to the jet bridge entrance with a faint hint of disdain. Beside her, Emily Hart gave a barely audible snort of laughter, whispering, "Looks like the nanny got an upgrade." Derek Wallace, the male attendant, smirked and said, "Maybe she's here to fluff pillows." They hadn't noticed Aaliyah yet, but the atmosphere tightened as she walked through the cabin doorway. Their voices dropped, but the tension remained thick. Aaliyah's presence was a contrast to the usual passengers. No oversized designer bags, no flashy accessories. She was understated, blending sophistication with restraint. Yet, there was a palpable strength about her, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but demands respect. She paused briefly at the first row, sliding her carry-on smoothly into the overhead bin. The leather seat welcomed her like a familiar chair in an office, and she lowered herself down with precise control. No smile, no greeting, just the quiet settling of someone who belonged. The cabin went slightly still, as if sensing the difference. Clara's gaze sharpened, narrowing in on the figure now seated where the most influential passengers usually relaxed. Emily glanced sideways, biting her lip to suppress another chuckle. Aaliyah took out a tablet from her leather briefcase, flipping it open with calm focus. She scrolled through documents, contracts, reports, messages from her team. The world beyond the plane was a complicated place, and she had no time for distractions. Her mind wandered briefly, tracing the outline of the meeting waiting for her in London. This trip was more than a flight. It was a crucial moment for her company, Skyward Atlantic Airlines, a business she'd rebuilt with relentless dedication, the kind of company that pushed boundaries in aviation technology and ethics. She was proud, but this was just one step on a longer path. Suddenly, a sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am," Clara Simmons said. Her tone clipped. "We ask all support staff to remain behind the curtain during boarding." Aaliyah looked up slowly, eyes steady and unreadable. Support staff. The word hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with assumptions that didn't fit the woman sitting so calmly. Before she could respond, a slight commotion began near the back of the cabin. A middle-aged woman in oversized sunglasses and an expensive gray coat leaned forward from her seat, holding out a crumpled napkin with a smudge of lipstick. "Wipe this," the woman said sharply, voice tight. "I spilled a bit of wine. Don't let it soak in." Aaliyah's eyes lifted toward her slowly. Not shocked, not offended, just quiet, observant. "Wipe it," the woman repeated, narrowing her eyes. "Or are you waiting for a tip first?" The words were laced with condescension, a reminder that this woman, despite her executive poise, was invisible in the eyes of some. Not for lack of presence, but because others refused to see her for who she was. Around her, a few other passengers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Aaliyah did not reach for the napkin. Instead, she touched the screen of her tablet and began typing, ignoring the ripple of whispered judgments. At that moment, Emily Hart approached. "Ma'am," she said briskly, "recording on board is prohibited without permission." Aaliyah's hand moved toward her handbag to retrieve her phone, calm and unhurried. Before she could bring the device to her face, Derek Wallace stepped forward, his palm snapping sharply against her wrist. The phone slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor. The screen fractured in a spider web of glass, the lens shattered. Gasps echoed quietly around the cabin. Aaliyah bent down slowly to retrieve it. Her face betrayed no anger, only a quiet assessment of the damage not just to her device, but to the fragile boundary of respect. Clara Simmons appeared beside her, voice low but firm. "You think you can act like that in first class? People like you always think you're owed something." The words hit hard, sharper than the broken glass beneath her fingers. Aaliyah's throat tightened, but she said nothing. 2 rows behind, the older woman folded her napkin and sat back, satisfied. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances. Outside the cabin curtain, a tall man in a sharply pressed uniform, Officer Michael Reynolds, stepped aboard. His mirrored sunglasses concealed eyes trained to detect trouble. He did not ask questions, only walked purposefully toward Aaliyah. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady but authoritative, "I need you to come with me." A young woman from row 2, Amelia Jones, spoke up gently. "She hasn't done anything wrong. I saw the whole thing." But Clara raised a hand, silencing the protest. "Security concern," she said sharply. "Please stay out of this." The officer's grip on Aaliyah's arm was firm but not harsh. She stood, calm and unresisting, her eyes meeting those of Clara, Derek, and Emily one last time. 2 minutes later, She was escorted out of first class, her broken phone still clutched tightly in one hand, and in that quiet moment, without a word spoken, a powerful message was sent. The first-class cabin had fallen into a strange silence after Aaliyah Morgan was escorted out. The hum of the plane's ventilation and the occasional clink of glass were the only sounds filling the space, but inside, tension still lingered like a thick fog, wrapping itself around every seat and every gaze. Back in her seat, Aaliyah had barely settled before the unexpected happened. The soft rustling of a coat drew her attention to the woman in the gray designer jacket who had leaned across the aisle earlier. The same woman who had handed her the crumpled napkin. Now, with an imperious air, she extended it toward Aaliyah once again. "Wipe this," she ordered sharply. Her voice carried that unmistakable edge, the kind of clipped tone reserved for someone giving commands rather than making requests. Aaliyah looked up slowly. Her eyes met the woman's for a brief moment, a silent exchange filled with layers of history neither dared to speak aloud. Aaliyah did not reach for the napkin. The woman's lips curled into a sneer. "Are you waiting for a tip first?" she hissed, clearly expecting humiliation or a rebuttal, but Aaliyah said nothing. She simply stared back with steady calm, her face an unreadable mask. The cabin's quiet swallowed her silence and magnified its power. Nearby, Clara Simmons watched the scene unfold. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. Emily Hart shifted on her feet, barely suppressing a giggle. Derek Wallace chuckled softly, glancing at Clara for confirmation that their disdain was justified. This moment was small, but charged with meaning. It was a microcosm of the entire flight, the unspoken assumptions and invisible lines drawn between us and them. Aaliyah's mind briefly wandered to the countless times she had been in rooms where she was the only black woman. The only one who didn't quite fit the expected mold. She thought about boardrooms filled with executives who glanced past her, airlines that offered upgraded seats only after protracted negotiations, and the weight of those moments stacking up over years. Now, here she was, in the most exclusive space on the plane, reduced by some to a person whose only role was to clean up after others. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in the moment. There was no room for anger, now only clarity. Before Aaliyah could say or do anything, Clara Simmons approached, her posture stiff and her voice cold. "Ma'am, we ask that all support staff remain behind the curtain during boarding." The words hit with the force of a gavel. Support staff. Aaliyah's lips pressed into a thin line. The insult wasn't just in the words, but in the assumptions they carried. She reached into her leather handbag, her fingers finding the familiar smoothness of her phone. Calm and deliberate. She pulled it out and tapped the screen, preparing to record the unfolding incident. But before she could raise the device, Derek Wallace stepped forward suddenly and slapped her wrist. The phone slipped from her grasp and hit the floor with a sharp crack. The screen fractured instantly, spiderweb patterns spreading outwards from the point of impact. Gasps echoed quietly around the cabin. Aaliyah bent to retrieve the broken device, turning it over in her hand. The camera lens was shattered, useless. Clara's voice rose with a sharp edge. "You think you can act like that in first class? You people always think you're owed something." The phrase stung deeply. You people, an accusation wrapped in years of systemic bias and social hierarchy. Aaliyah's chest tightened. The memories of every time she'd been reduced to a stereotype flashed in her mind. Yet she said nothing aloud. Instead, she rose from her seat with quiet dignity. the weight of the broken phone heavy in her palm. 2 rows behind, the woman in the gray coat folded her napkin carefully and sat back with a satisfied expression, convinced that order had been restored. Emily Hart's giggle broke the silence, a cruel echo of mockery as she mimicked Aaliyah's calm voice. 2 minutes. Ooh, I'm so scared. The laughter spread quietly among the flight attendants. The humiliation was theirs, a performance for the cabin. But Aaliyah's silence cut deeper than any words. It was a refusal to be diminished, a quiet but unyielding stand. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some averted their eyes, others stared, unsure where to place their allegiance. Among them, Amelia Jones, a young woman in business attire seated in row 3, raised her phone discreetly and began recording. Her expression was serious, her fingers steady. She understood the importance of this moment not just for Aaliyah, but for everyone who had ever been unseen, unheard. Aaliyah's mind raced. The familiar knot of frustration, humiliation, and resolve twisted inside her. Why was she the target? Because she was black, because she carried herself with confidence in a space that still clung to outdated rules, because her presence threatened their comfortable narratives. But this time, she would not disappear. Officer Michael Reynolds appeared in the aisle, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the tension around him. He moved deliberately toward Aaliyah, voice firm but devoid of malice. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." The cabin's atmosphere thickened. Aaliyah's heart beat steadily, not with fear but with purpose. A young passenger from row 2 spoke up softly. "She's done nothing wrong. I saw everything." But Clara Simmons raised a hand to silence the protest. "Security concern, please remain seated." The officer's hand gripped Aaliyah's wrist firmly, guiding her toward the curtain. Her other hand still held the shattered phone. She rose smoothly, never faltering, eyes locking with Clara's one last time. There was no fear in Aaliyah's gaze, only quiet strength. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy looks as she passed by. Outside the curtain, she leaned against the wall, waiting in silence, her mind replaying every moment the napkin, the phone, the words spoken, and those left unspoken. She was alone, but unbroken. 2 minutes, then everything flips. The phrase echoed in her thoughts, a quiet mantra against the storm of injustice. She would not shout, she would not beg, she would simply show up. The narrow hallway behind the curtain was dimmer, cooler, a stark contrast to the soft light and polished surfaces of first class. Aaliyah leaned against the wall, her posture straight but relaxed. The shattered phone still clutched in her hand. The quiet thrum of the plane's engines was the only sound, yet it felt distant, as if muted by the weight of what had just occurred. Officer Michael Reynolds stood nearby, arms crossed, his face unreadable beneath the tinted lenses of his sunglasses. He said nothing for a long moment, watching her with a mixture of duty and curiosity. Aaliyah met his gaze evenly, the calmness in her eyes a silent challenge. "You plannin' to press charges?" she asked softly, voice steady but low. The officer blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Pardon. You put your hand on me. You better know why," she said, her words deliberate, measured. He straightened, shifting his stance. "I was told you were causing a disturbance, refused to move from your seat." "I sat in the seat printed on my boarding pass," Aaliyah replied. Her mind flickered briefly back to the cabin, the sneers, the whispered insults, the deliberate erasure of her presence. Reynolds nodded slowly. "We're verifying your ticket. Wait here." Aaliyah said nothing more. She folded her arms and let her gaze drift upward to the ceiling panels, reflecting on how the day had spiraled. Inside the cabin, Clara Simmons paced near the galley, whispering sharply to Emily Hart and Derek Wallace. The tension was palpable. "You two need to stay calm," Clara hissed. "We'll file an incident report. Say she became aggressive, refused instructions." Brian, a junior attendant who had watched from the sidelines, muttered uncertainly. "She didn't even raise her voice." "That's not the point," Clara snapped. "We're not letting some entitled imposter tank our records. I've flown with senators and celebrities. We don't lose face over someone who can't follow protocol." Emily rolled her eyes. "You think she's anyone important?" Clara scoffed. "If she was, she'd have said so. People like that never shut up about who they are." Derek smirked. "Yeah? Did you see her shoes like orthopedic loafers?" Their laughter was sharp, but behind it lay a gnawing unease. Meanwhile, back near the galley, Aaliyah remained silent, lost in a swirl of thoughts. Why was it so hard to be seen as herself, not as a role or a stereotype, but simply as a person? She thought of the countless boardrooms where her ideas had been overlooked, the times she'd been the only black woman in the room, navigating unspoken barriers, the battles fought quietly, in smiles that masked exhaustion and in words that carried double meanings. Her hand tightened around the broken phone. It was more than a device. It was a symbol, a fracture in the facade of civility that hid deep-rooted bias. Her eyes flicked to the flight attendant crew's whispers and laughter, then back to the waiting officer. 2 minutes, then everything flips. That mantra echoed in her mind, steady and resolute. Her thoughts were interrupted as the cabin curtain shifted. Dale Mercer, the senior operations VP for Skyward Atlantic Airlines, stepped through, his face grave. His eyes flicked toward Aaliyah with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Miss Morgan," he said quietly, "we're convening an executive review panel. We regret the delay." Aaliyah nodded slightly, rising to follow him toward the cramped conference room near the rear of the aircraft. Clara moved to block her path, voice sharp. "You don't have the authority here." Aaliyah met her gaze, unwavering. "I have proof." She pulled a sleek leather ID wallet from her bag, flipping it open to reveal the polished badge bearing her name and title, Aaliyah Morgan, CEO, Skyward Atlantic Airlines. Clara's face drained of color. "You're ruining careers." "No," Aaliyah replied softly. "You did. I'm just notarizing the result." Dale Mercer gestured to the room. "We'll begin the panel now." Inside, 5 executives sat tensely around a matty black table, screens displaying time-stamped logs, internal chat transcripts, and still images from passenger recordings. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken judgments. Aaliyah took her seat at the head of the table, her presence commanding silence. No need for grand speeches or dramatic flourishes. Her calmness was a statement in itself. She slid a folder across the table, filled with evidence of the incident and detailed accounts of systemic bias within the airline. "You let your crew override dignity," she said quietly, eyes locking with Clara's on the screen. The room held its breath. Then the head of operations spoke. "We are within grounds to terminate the aircraft outfitting contract and demand full damages." Aaliyah did not flinch. "No press conference," she said softly. "No reactive statements. We show leadership." Her assistant, Jada Coleman, leaned in with a tablet. "The Pentagon liaison wants to know if you'll attend Friday's procurement briefing." "I will," Aaliyah replied, but with a different airline. Laughter rippled around the room, but no one mistook it for humor. The meeting ended, but the fight had only just begun. Back in the cabin, Amelia Jones reviewed her video footage one last time. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she uploaded it to social media, captioning it simply, "This woman was dragged out of first class for being black and quiet. Watch what happens next." Echo silence. Aaliyah Morgan. Within minutes, thousands were watching. Newsrooms buzzed. Social media exploded. The story was no longer just about one flight. It had become a symbol. Aaliyah sat quietly in the waiting lounge, her tea untouched beside her, eyes distant yet focused. She was ready. The fluorescent lights of the small conference room flickered softly as Aaliyah Morgan stood beside the polished black table. The sterile atmosphere was a stark contrast to the storm swirling in her mind. Around her, a dozen executives sat stiffly, eyes flickering between her and the screens that displayed fragments of the unfolding incident. Clara Simmons sat at the far end, her posture rigid, her face pale beneath the weight of realization. Aaliyah reached into her blazer's inner pocket and pulled out a sleek black leather ID wallet. With deliberate calm, she flipped it open and held it before the senior airline staff. The polished metal badge glinted under the harsh lights. Aaliyah Morgan, Chief Executive Officer, Skyward Atlantic Airlines. The room seemed to hold its breath. The air thickened as shock rippled through the group like an unseen wave. For a moment, no one spoke. Then came the sharp intake of breath from Clara. Her eyes widened in disbelief. The same eyes that had earlier dismissed Aaliyah as invisible now struggled to reconcile the truth. I didn't know," Clara stammered, her voice barely audible. "No one did," Aaliyah replied quietly. Her tone was even, but beneath it lay a current of steel. "Until now." Dale Mercer, the senior operations VP, leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "This changes everything. The repercussions." "Yes," Aaliyah interrupted gently, "but it also reveals everything." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. This was not just a personnel issue anymore. This was a scandal that could shake the very foundations of their company. Outside the small room, whispers buzzed down the corridors of the plane. Passengers watched as the cabin crew hurriedly spoke with their supervisors. News of the incident had spread quickly, whispers morphing into murmurs. In the lounge, Aaliyah sat alone. Her shattered phone lay beside her, a tangible reminder of the invisible fractures she had endured. The bruises of bias were often unseen, but this broken device now bore witness to the violence of erasure. Her assistant, Jada Coleman, approached with a tablet in hand, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "Miss Morgan," she said softly, "the media is already picking up the story. Social platforms are ablaze. We have hashtags trending in several cities. Should we escalate to legal counsel?" Aaliyah looked up, her eyes steady. "Not yet," she replied quietly. "Let the truth speak first." Jada nodded, respect evident in her gaze. The story had ignited a fire that could not be easily contained. The airline's executive board convened an emergency meeting. The public relations director's face was flushed from a hurried phone call. "Do you understand the magnitude of this?" she demanded. "We've apologized." The crew offered to reinstate her seat. "What more does she want?" "What she wants," the younger VP said coldly, is accountability, not just an apology. In the background, Amelia Jones, the young passenger who had filmed the incident, reviewed the video again. She saw the faces of the flight attendants, the cold professionalism of Officer Reynolds, and the quiet dignity of Aaliyah. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed. This is bigger than one flight. It's a moment. Watch it unfold. Echo silence. Aaliyah Morgan. Within minutes, the video had thousands of shares. Across the city, former military veterans stopped in front of airport monitors. One recognized Aaliyah immediately. That's the woman who spearheaded the redesign of the cockpit safety systems last year. He said, she saved more lives than they ever realized. Another nodded, pulling out his phone. She's owed more than a seat. She's owed respect. The video spread far beyond the airline's usual reach. It had become a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had long been unseen and unheard. Meanwhile, the airline's CEO woke to the unfolding crisis. His office was quiet except for the urgent buzz of incoming calls. His eyes scanned the reports, the video, and the social media storm. "We have to act fast," he muttered. "Suspend the crew immediately, issue a formal apology, manage the fallout." But the storm had already grown beyond control. Back in the lounge, Aaliyah's phone buzzed with a call. It was Mark Ellis, her trusted legal counsel. "Miss Morgan." His voice was calm but firm. "The company is prepared to offer a settlement. They want to resolve this quietly." Aaliyah took a deep breath. "Mark," she said steadily, "I'm not interested in settlements. This isn't about money. It's about dignity. It's about changing the system." "Understood," Mark replied. "I'll prepare for the next steps." That evening, as the plane prepared to depart, the cabin was unusually quiet. The usual hum of luxury had been replaced by a tense stillness. 6 careers had been irreparably damaged by the unfolding scandal, and the ripples were just beginning. Aaliyah sat alone, her coat buttoned tightly against the cool cabin air. The shattered phone lay beside her, silent testimony to the day's events. She did not speak. Her silence was louder than any protest. Her eyes closed briefly, remembering the moment when she was first handed the napkin, the moment when she was invisible. But she had shown up, and the world had no choice but to look. The moment the video went live, it spread like wildfire. Social media feeds flooded with comments, shares, and debates. Hashtags like Modern Echo Silence and Aaliyah Morgan trended across multiple platforms, sparking conversations that echoed far beyond the confines of that flight. Aaliyah sat quietly in her hotel room in London, the city lights twinkling outside the window, oblivious to the storm brewing within. The glow of her laptop illuminated her calm face as she read through the endless stream of reactions. Some messages were supportive, filled with encouragement and solidarity. Others were cruel and dismissive, laced with the same biases that had fueled her humiliation just days before. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Calls from reporters, colleagues, legal advisors, and even strangers who wanted to share their own stories of discrimination. She felt the weight of their expectations pressing on her shoulders, yet she remained composed. Jada Coleman, her assistant, stood nearby holding a tablet displaying the latest news coverage. "The story has reached over 1 million views in just a few hours," Jada said softly. "The public is demanding answers. The airline is scrambling to manage the fallout." Aaliyah nodded thoughtfully. "This isn't just about me," she said quietly. "It's about every person who's ever been erased or silenced." She thought back to the countless times she had sat in boardrooms where her voice was overshadowed, where her presence was questioned, and where she was expected to prove her worth repeatedly. The pattern was the same, an invisible barrier built on assumptions, stereotypes, and systemic prejudice. That evening, a press conference was held by Skyward Atlantic Airlines. The company's CEO issued a carefully worded apology, expressing regret over the incident and promising a full investigation. But Aaliyah knew that words alone would not heal the wounds inflicted not just on her, but on everyone who had been subjected to similar treatment. Across the country, activists and advocacy groups seized on the moment. Online forums and community centers buzzed with discussions about racial bias, power dynamics, and the urgent need for systemic change. The incident became a catalyst, shining a harsh light on the uncomfortable truths lurking within the airline industry and beyond. Meanwhile, inside the company, tensions ran high. Clara Simmons and her colleagues faced mounting scrutiny. Their social media accounts were flooded with critical comments and calls for accountability. Clara's family and friends confronted her with difficult questions, forcing her to reflect on her actions and attitudes. Emily Hart deleted her social media profiles entirely, overwhelmed by the backlash. Derek Wallace considered leaving the industry altogether, his confidence shattered. But for Aaliyah, the real battle was just beginning. She wrestled with the decision of how public to make her response. To speak out loudly risked alienating potential allies and escalating tensions. To remain silent risked allowing the injustice to be forgotten. Her internal dialogue was a constant tug-of-war. Should she demand justice through legal channels? Would that change anything or simply deepen divisions? Could silence itself be a weapon? Could she use restraint to expose the cruelty of prejudice without descending into anger? In the quiet moments between meetings and media appearances, Aaliyah found herself questioning the limits of her strength. The burden of representation weighed heavily. She was no longer just a CEO, she had become a symbol. Late one night, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of herbal tea. The only sound, the soft ticking of a clock. Her thoughts drifted to her childhood, to the lessons her mother had taught her about dignity and resilience. She remembered a particular phrase that had always stuck with her. "You don't have to shout to be heard." That became her mantra. Over the following days, Aaliyah worked closely with her legal team, crafting a strategic plan that balanced quiet strength with unwavering resolve. She coordinated with media advisors to ensure that her message was clear and focused not on personal grievance, but on systemic change. Her decision was to launch a campaign that would hold airlines accountable for discrimination and bias, a campaign that would be relentless but dignified. The campaign was named Echo Silence. It was designed to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced, to create a platform where subtle acts of prejudice could no longer hide in the shadows. The initiative proposed a system for anonymous reporting, training modules to educate airline staff about implicit bias, and partnerships with civil rights organizations to ensure transparency and accountability. Aaliyah poured herself into this work, finding purpose in transforming pain into progress. But the challenges were many. Not everyone was ready to change. Some industry leaders dismissed Echo Silence as political posturing. Others feared the financial and reputational risks of such transparency. Within her own company, resistance simmered beneath the surface. Some executives worried that the campaign would damage business relationships. Others questioned the need for change at all. Yet Aaliyah remained steadfast. She spent hours in meetings, patiently answering questions, addressing concerns, and building coalitions. Her inner strength became a beacon for her team and supporters. At night, she allowed herself moments of vulnerability, moments where the weight of fatigue and frustration pressed in. She confided in Jada, who reminded her gently, "You're not alone in this. Your courage has already inspired so many," and that gave Aaliyah the strength to keep moving forward. Outside, the world was watching. News outlets covered the growing movement. Social media buzzed with stories of people sharing their own experiences of bias and exclusion. Communities rallied around the cause, organizing forums, workshops, and advocacy campaigns. Aaliyah's story had sparked a conversation that refused to be silenced. One afternoon, as she reviewed the latest feedback from the passengers and employees, a message caught her eye. It was from a young woman who had been too afraid to speak out for years. She wrote, "I was invisible on that flight, but because of you, I feel seen. Thank you." Aaliyah smiled softly. This was why she endured. This was why she chose silence not as submission, but as a deliberate, powerful stance. Her journey was far from over, but in that moment, she knew that the ripple she had started was becoming a wave, and the world could no longer look away. The office where Aaliyah Morgan and her team gathered was bright but quiet, a sharp contrast to the storm that had unfolded just weeks before. The sleek conference room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooked the city skyline, reminders of the heights Aaliyah had climbed and the battles still ahead. Around the table sat a diverse group of advisors, engineers, legal experts, and civil rights advocates. They were united by a common mission to build something that could change the airline industry from within. Echo Silence was no ordinary initiative. It was a bold vision to confront the subtle, systemic biases that had long been ignored or dismissed. Its aim was to create accountability through transparency and technology, to ensure that dignity was not something passengers had to earn, but a baseline guaranteed by design. Aaliyah looked around the room. Her calm demeanor masked the fierce determination within. The day's agenda was ambitious, finalizing the anonymous reporting system, rolling out bias training modules, and setting up partnerships with watchdog organizations. Echo Silence isn't just a program, Aaliyah began, her voice steady and clear. It's a movement. It's about giving power back to those who have been silenced for too long. She paused, letting her words settle. This is about changing how we see each other in every interaction, from the gate agent who greets you to the flight attendant who assists you. It's about building a culture where respect is automatic, not optional. Her team nodded, some taking notes, others exchanging determined looks. Jada Coleman, her assistant, tapped on the screen to display a prototype of the anonymous reporting app. "This interface is simple and accessible," Jada explained. "Passengers and employees can submit incidents in real time, without fear of retaliation or exposure. Each report will be verified and analyzed to identify patterns of discrimination." Across the room, Mark Ellis, Aaliyah's legal counsel, spoke up. "From a compliance standpoint, this system must be airtight. We need clear protocols for investigation, transparency in outcomes, and protections for whistleblowers." Aaliyah nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly." Echo Silence isn't about punishment, it's about prevention. It's about creating a system that learns and adapts. The conversation shifted to training. Renee Bennett, the communications advisor, outlined plans for immersive workshops designed to address implicit bias and microaggressions. "These sessions won't be optional fluff," Renee said. "They'll challenge employees to confront uncomfortable truths and equip them with tools to change behavior." Aaliyah leaned forward. "We want this training to be continuous, integrated into certification processes. Change takes time and persistence." The room buzzed with energy, but beneath the enthusiasm lurked awareness of the obstacles ahead. Resistance was inevitable. Some airline executives viewed echo silence as a threat to their established order. They feared that transparency might expose uncomfortable truths and disrupt profit margins. Aaliyah understood this all too well. Change always provoked discomfort. She reflected on Clara Simmons and her colleagues, whose attitudes embodied the resistance echo silence aimed to dismantle. Yet, even among skeptics, seeds of change could be planted. Outside the corporate walls, the public response was growing louder. Grassroots organizations, civil rights groups, and passenger advocates rallied behind echo silence. Their stories gave voice to those who had suffered in silence. In meetings with industry leaders, Aaliyah remained calm but firm. Denial is no longer an option. She told a gathering of executives, "We must acknowledge the biases embedded in our systems and take responsibility to fix them." Some executives nodded reluctantly. Others shifted uncomfortably. But the message was clear. Aaliyah's inner resolve was tested daily. There were moments of doubt, long nights reviewing reports of new incidents, the frustration of slow institutional change, the weight of representing so many who had been marginalized. One evening, she sat alone in her office, a quiet space adorned with framed photos of her childhood and early career. She stared at a letter from a passenger who had shared a story of exclusion and hope. The words touched her deeply. She thought of the power of silence, the choice to speak or not, to resist or comply. For Aaliyah, silence was no longer a refuge, but a strategy. It was a way to command attention without shouting, to hold space without chaos. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. Jada entered with a message from Amelia Jones, the young journalist who had filmed the original incident. "Amelia wants to meet," Jada said. "She's been working on a documentary about echo silence and wants your perspective." Aaliyah smiled softly. Amelia's role as a witness had evolved into that of a storyteller, a crucial ally in amplifying the movement's reach. The following day, Aaliyah met Amelia in a quiet cafe. They discussed the narrative carefully, how to frame the story not as a tale of victimhood, but one of resilience and systemic transformation. Amelia's camera captured the subtle strength in Aaliyah's gaze, the quiet determination etched into every gesture. Their collaboration was a testament to the power of partnership between those who lead and those who bear witness. As echo silence began to take shape, Aaliyah's thoughts returned to the cabin on that fateful flight, the moment when a simple napkin had sparked a revolution. She understood now that every small act of bias was a thread in a larger fabric of injustice, and that fabric needed to be unraveled with care, persistence, and courage. Echo silence was her answer, not a loud declaration, but a quiet revolution. Echo silence had officially launched, yet the road ahead was anything but smooth. Though the initiative had ignited conversations and rallied support from many corners, resistance simmered beneath the surface, revealing the deep-rooted challenges that came with confronting systemic bias. Aaliyah Morgan felt the weight of this resistance every day, Behind closed doors, she faced boardrooms filled with executives reluctant to embrace transparency, fearful of the consequences echo silence might bring. Their unease wasn't just about optics, it was about control, profit, and tradition. During one tense meeting, a senior executive voiced the concerns simmering among some colleagues. This level of scrutiny will cripple operational efficiency. Staff will be afraid to make decisions, and our reputation will suffer. Aaliyah listened carefully, her calm gaze steady. True leadership requires accountability, she replied firmly. We cannot prioritize comfort over dignity. Echo silence is not a threat, it is a necessary evolution. Despite her resolve, the friction was real. Some departments pushed back quietly, delaying implementation or minimizing the significance of reported incidents. The cultural shift Aaliyah envisioned demanded not just policies, but a transformation of attitudes. She thought often about Clara Simmons, whose actions on that flight had sparked the movement. Clara represented a mindset that was deeply ingrained, not easily uprooted. Yet Aaliyah knew that change would only come if those like Clara were confronted not with hostility, but with opportunity to learn and grow. In a moment of introspection, Aaliyah sat alone in her office, reviewing internal communications from employees across the airline. Some shared stories of renewed commitment to equity, while others revealed doubts and fears about their place in the changing landscape. Her own journey had been marked by silence and resilience, a balancing act between asserting authority and choosing when to speak. She recalled the phrase her mother had often repeated sometimes. Silence is the loudest voice you have, but she also recognized that silence without action was complicity. Echo. Silence was her answer, a way to break the silence constructively. Outside the corporate world, the public response continued to swell. Social media became a platform for truth-telling and solidarity, but it also revealed the persistence of prejudice in everyday interactions. One viral post came from a young woman who recounted how she had been asked repeatedly if she was cleaning staff on a business trip. Another shared how a family member was downgraded to economy despite having paid for premium seats. These stories echoed Aaliyah's own experience, underscoring how bias was often subtle, yet deeply damaging. Aaliyah met frequently with advocacy groups and community leaders, seeking to build bridges and amplify voices that had long been marginalized. She understood that change required collaboration across sectors and lived experiences. At a national conference on transportation equity, Aaliyah took the stage to address an audience of policymakers, industry leaders, and activists. Her speech was measured but powerful. We must confront not only overt discrimination, but also the quiet biases that shape our systems, she said. Echo silence is a tool to expose these patterns and ensure that respect is not discretionary. Her words resonated, but she also sensed the daunting scale of the challenge ahead. Back at Skyward Atlantic, Clara Simmons found herself increasingly isolated. The incident had exposed cracks in her confidence and forced her to confront uncomfortable truths. She reflected on her actions not to justify them, but to understand the fears and prejudices that had driven them. It was a painful process, marked by moments of denial and shame. Emily Hart and Derek Wallace wrestled with similar struggles. The backlash had cost them friends, reputations, and in some cases, their livelihoods. Yet, amid the turmoil, some found a path toward change. Clara enrolled in Echo Silence training sessions, hesitant but willing to listen. The workshops challenged her assumptions and offered new perspectives. It was not an easy journey. Old habits die hard, and the process of unlearning bias was ongoing and sometimes painful. Meanwhile, Aaliyah continued to carry the emotional burden of leadership. There were nights when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, moments when the enormity of the work ahead felt daunting. She confided in Jada Coleman, who reminded her gently, "You're not alone in this. Change takes time, and every step forward matters." In quieter moments, Aaliyah wrote in her journal reflecting on the complex interplay between power, silence, and courage. She explored the tension between the personal and the political, the visible and the invisible. Her reflections deepened her understanding that true progress required both boldness and grace. At the same time, new challenges emerged. Some critics accused echo silence of overreach, claiming it created a culture of suspicion and fear among staff. Others questioned the focus on race, arguing that the program marginalized other forms of bias. Aaliyah addressed these concerns openly, emphasizing the program's inclusive intent. Echo silence is about dignity for all, she explained. It recognizes that bias takes many forms, and that our goal is to create a culture where everyone feels seen and respected. Her message struck a chord with many, but the debates revealed the complexities inherent in systemic change. Through it all, Aaliyah remained anchored by her vision and her commitment to those who had suffered in silence. She continued to meet with survivors of bias, listening deeply and incorporating their stories into the evolving framework of echo silence. Their courage fueled her determination. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Aaliyah stood at her apartment window, looking out over the city lights. The skyline shimmered, a mosaic of possibilities and challenges. She took a deep breath, drawing strength from the quiet night. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she was ready. For every step forward, for every voice raised and heard, the movement grew stronger. Echo silence was no longer just an initiative, it was a revolution of the unseen. Months after the Echo Silence Initiative launched, the ripples of Aaliyah Morgan's quiet revolution reached far beyond the walls of Skyward Atlantic Airlines. What began as a personal confrontation in the first-class cabin had blossomed into a movement that was reshaping the way institutions across the globe understood equity, dignity, and accountability. The venue was a large conference hall in Geneva, Switzerland, where leaders from the aviation industry, government regulators, and human rights organizations had gathered for an international summit on transportation equity. Delegates from over 50 countries filled the seats, their faces reflecting a shared urgency and hope. Aaliyah stood backstage, the hum of the crowd filtering through the thick curtains. She adjusted her navy blazer and took a deep breath. This wasn't just another speech. It was a declaration of a new era. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage with a quiet confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. The spotlight was soft. The room hushed. She began without slides or embellishments. Her voice was steady, clear, and calm. "We are not here to make passengers feel safe," she said, scanning the audience slowly. "We are here to make passengers safe. Period." A ripple passed through the crowd. "Equity is not an add-on," she continued. "It is not a weekend workshop or a box to be checked. It is the foundation upon which every policy, every interaction, every system must be built." Her words carried the weight of lived experience and hard-won insight. She shared case studies from echo-silent stories of subtle bias and overt exclusion, but also of courage, resilience, and change. She spoke of the anonymous reporting systems that had uncovered patterns of discrimination previously hidden in plain sight, of training modules that challenged staff to confront their own assumptions, of partnerships with civil rights groups that ensured transparency and accountability. The delegates listened intently. Questions followed tough, probing inquiries about implementation challenges, cultural resistance, and scalability. Aaliyah answered each with patience and honesty, acknowledging the difficulties while emphasizing the necessity of progress. After her speech, as the summit broke into smaller sessions, a group of regulators from Singapore approached her. "Your framework offers a blueprint we've been searching for." One official said, "We'd like to collaborate on adapting it for our national carriers." This was just one example of the movement's expanding reach. Back in the United States, media coverage framed Aaliyah as a pioneering leader not only in business but in social justice. Profiles in major publications highlighted her journey from a quiet, determined CEO to the face of systemic change. Yet, Aaliyah remained grounded. She knew that true transformation required more than headlines and accolades. Her work shifted toward embedding echo silence into broader infrastructure. Discussions began with transportation departments, civil service agencies, and even school districts to adapt the principles of accountability and dignity into varied contexts. In Washington, D.C., she met with senators and aides who debated the policy implications of her initiative. The discussions were complex and at times contentious, reflecting the nation's divided stance on equity and reform. One senator challenged her. "How do you ensure that this doesn't become a tool for political gamesmanship or overregulation?" Aaliyah responded thoughtfully, "Our goal is to build trust through transparency. When people see that their dignity is protected, they engage more fully and fairly. It's about strengthening institutions, not weakening them." Behind closed doors, her legal team worked tirelessly to navigate the regulatory landscape. They drafted proposals to embed echo silence principles into federal aviation standards and worker protections. Amelia Jones, now a policy advisor and key partner in the movement, coordinated outreach and communication strategies. Together, they cultivated a network of allies from grassroots organizations to international bodies. Yet, amid the successes, challenges persisted. Not every institution was willing to embrace change. Some carriers resisted, citing costs and tradition. Others argued that bias was overstated or inevitable. Aaliyah encountered these objections with steady resolve. She recalled the countless stories she had heard, stories of passengers overlooked, dismissed, and degraded. Stories not often told in boardrooms or media sound bites. She also thought of Clara Simmons, who had quietly begun to change, attending training sessions and engaging in difficult conversations. Change was slow and uneven, but it was happening. Late one evening, as she reviewed a report of new bias incidents submitted through the Echo Silence platform, Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Each report was a reminder of why this work mattered, not just for her or for those like her, but for everyone who deserved to be seen and respected. She closed her laptop and looked out over the city lights shimmering beneath the night sky. This was no longer just her story. It was a global movement, and it was unstoppable. As Echo Silence gained momentum on the global stage, the spotlight that shone on Aaliyah Morgan illuminated not only the successes, but also the quiet struggles behind the scenes. Leadership carried its burdens in silence. burdens that weighed heavily on her shoulders, unseen by most but deeply felt. In the early mornings, before the city awoke, Aaliyah often found herself alone in her apartment, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the ticking of a clock. The stillness was both a refuge and a reminder of the loneliness that came with her position. Despite the growing recognition and support, she grappled with an internal battle, a tension between the public figure who championed change and the private woman who bore the scars of prejudice. She thought often about the moment on that flight, the simple act of being handed a dirty napkin and the invisible assumptions it represented. That moment had shattered more than just her phone. It had cracked open a narrative that demanded to be rewritten. Yet, as the face of a movement, she was expected to be unwavering strong, composed, unshakable. The pressure to embody perfection was relentless. Jada Coleman, ever the steadfast ally, noticed the toll it took. One afternoon, as they reviewed campaign strategies, Jada gently suggested, "You need to rest. Aaliyah, you can't carry this alone." Aaliyah smiled faintly. "I know, but it's hard to step back when there's still so much to do." Jada's eyes softened. "You're not alone in this fight. Remember that." In moments of solitude, Aaliyah wrestled with doubt. Was her silence truly powerful? Or was it a mask for the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her? Could one woman change an entire industry entrenched in centuries of inequality? She found solace in her journal, a place where she poured her fears, hopes, and reflections onto the page. Her entries were candid, acknowledging the fatigue, the moments of frustration, and the quiet victories. "You don't have to shout to be heard," she wrote one evening, echoing her mother's wisdom. "But sometimes the loudest voice is the one that listens." The personal sacrifices were significant. Relationships strained under the weight of her commitments. Invitations to family gatherings were often declined due to meetings or travel. The moments of stillness she cherished were increasingly rare. Yet, even in the face of isolation, Aaliyah remained resolute. Her empathy, a source of strength, also made the burden heavier. She absorbed the pain of countless stories shared with her, stories of exclusion, discrimination, and resilience. Each story was a reminder of why her work mattered. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Aaliyah received a message from a passenger she had never met. The note was simple but profound. "I was invisible on that flight, but because of you, I am seen now. Thank you." The words struck a chord deep within her. She realized that while the battles were often quiet and unseen, their impact was real. Meanwhile, the airline industry continued to grapple with change. Some employees embraced echo silence wholeheartedly, attending workshops and engaging in honest dialogues. Others resisted, clinging to old ways or fearing the unknown. Clara Simmons was among those wrestling with transformation. After months of reflection and training, she reached out to Aaliyah with a letter and apology tinged with hope. "I was wrong to judge you," Clara wrote. "Your strength showed me what I had been blind to. I want to do better." Aaliyah read the letter with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. It was a small but meaningful step toward healing and progress. Back at headquarters, Aaliyah met regularly with her team to strategize and celebrate milestones. Amelia Jones had become a vital voice, helping to shape communications and public outreach. Together, they reviewed data showing a gradual decline in reported bias incidents, a hopeful sign that echo silence was beginning to change behaviors. Yet, Aaliyah knew that statistics could not capture the full story. Change was a human process, messy, complicated, and ongoing. She carried this understanding with her as she prepared for the next phase of the movement, expanding eco-silence beyond aviation to other sectors where silence had long masked injustice. One evening, as she spoke at a forum on workplace equity, Aaliyah shared her personal journey, the moments of invisibility, the power of silence, and the courage to speak. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I stand here, not as someone who has overcome every obstacle," she said, "but as someone who refuses to let silence be a weapon of erasure." The audience responded with heartfelt applause. As she left the stage, a young woman approached, tears in her eyes. "Your story gave me hope," she whispered. "Thank you for showing us that quiet strength can move mountains." Aaliyah smiled softly, feeling the weight of responsibility and the spark of connection. Her journey was far from over, but in the quiet moments of reflection, she found renewed purpose. Eco-silence was more than a movement. It was a testament to the power of resilience, empathy, and the courage to rewrite the stories that silence once told. The sun filtered softly through the windows of the Regional Training Center in Denver, casting long morning shadows across the polished floor. Aaliyah Morgan arrived early, her calm presence commanding quiet respect. Today marked a milestone, the first full day of eco-silence training for a group of local first responders and transit workers. The space was intentionally simple chairs arranged in a circle, posters displaying key principles of equity and accountability. This was ground zero for transformation beyond aviation, a test case for how the movement could ripple into other sectors. Aaliyah greeted the participants with a warm, genuine smile. Many were skeptical, others hopeful, but all carried the weight of their own experiences and biases. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice steady but inviting. Echo. Silence is about more than policy. It's about creating spaces where dignity is non-negotiable. She shared stories from the airline, illustrating how silence, both enforced and chosen, had shaped outcomes in critical moments. Her calm demeanor invited reflection rather than defensiveness. Throughout the day, participants engaged in role-playing scenarios, confronting implicit biases that affected decisions in emergency responses and customer service. The exercises were challenging, unearthing uncomfortable truths. A young paramedic named Marcus spoke up during a session, his voice tinged with hesitation. "I never thought about how my tone or glance might change how someone feels cared for. It's eye-opening, but also hard to accept." Aaliyah nodded. "Change is hard, but it begins with awareness. When we recognize our biases, we gain the power to choose differently." Between sessions, she held private conversations with individuals wrestling with the lessons. Some expressed fear of making mistakes, others confessed past errors with remorse. Aaliyah listened deeply, offering empathy without judgment. Her approach was one of partnership, not dictation. Outside the training center, news of the program's success spread. Other cities expressed interest in piloting eco-silence adaptations tailored to their communities. Yet, not all reactions were positive. In a private meeting with the mayor of a nearby city, Aaliyah faced pointed skepticism. "This sounds costly and complicated." The mayor said bluntly, "We have budgets to balance and constituents to satisfy. How do you convince people that this investment is worth it?" Aaliyah responded thoughtfully. "Investing in dignity and equity reduces long-term costs, fewer complaints, better employee retention, safer communities. It builds trust, which is invaluable. The mayor remained unconvinced but agreed to consider a pilot program. Back at Skyward Atlantic, the Echo Silence team continued refining the reporting system and training modules. Amelia Jones coordinated multilingual translations to ensure accessibility for diverse populations. One afternoon, Amelia approached Aaliyah with news of a breakthrough. "We've just received feedback from a passenger in New Mexico who used the reporting app to share an experience of racial profiling at a gate." The airline responded swiftly and implemented changes. "This is the impact we've been working for." Aaliyah smiled. These small victories were the building blocks of systemic change. Yet, she also understood the work required patience. Cultural shifts were gradual, often met with resistance and regression. At the same time, Aaliyah was called to testify before a congressional committee on transportation equity. The hearing was a high-stakes arena, with sharp questions from legislators representing diverse views. One senator challenged, "Ms. Morgan, how do you ensure that echo silence doesn't become a tool for frivolous complaints or harassment?" Aaliyah answered with clarity. "We have rigorous verification and investigation processes. Our goal is to uphold dignity, not weaponize reporting. Transparency builds trust and accountability." Her testimony was met with both praise and pushback, but it marked a critical moment of institutional recognition. Amid these public battles, Aaliyah also nurtured quieter connections. She spent time mentoring young women of color aspiring to leadership roles, sharing lessons from her own journey. In a recent conversation with a mentee, she emphasized the power of silent strength. "You don't always have to raise your voice to be heard," she said, "but you do have to show up, consistently and authentically." These moments reminded Aaliyah of why she persevered the ripple effect of visibility and courage. One evening, as she walked through a local community event, she was approached by a man who introduced himself as a retired flight attendant. "I saw what happened," he said quietly. "I never spoke up before, but your courage has inspired me to start." Aaliyah's eyes glistened. This was the quiet revolution in action, not loud or chaotic, but persistent and unstoppable. As she reflected on the day, she thought back to that first flight, the napkin, and the broken phone. That moment had set in motion a chain reaction, a movement grounded in empathy, resilience, and the refusal to accept silence as a default. Echo Silence was no longer just a program. It was a promise that every person, regardless of their role or background, deserved to be seen, heard, and respected. And as Aaliyah looked toward the horizon, she knew the journey was far from over, but the foundation was strong. The future was being built one quiet, powerful step at a time. The hum of the city outside was a distant echo as Aaliyah Morgan sat alone in her office late into the night. The walls, lined with framed photos and certificates, bore silent witness to years of hard-fought achievements. Yet tonight, the weight she carried felt heavier than ever. Change, she realized, came with costs unseen by the public eye. The headlines celebrated Echo Silence's success. The social media buzzed with praise and hopeful stories. Yet, within the corridors of power and everyday workplaces, the battle was far from over. Aaliyah's phone buzzed repeatedly, each notification pulling her back to the realities behind the movement. Messages from employees hesitant to speak out, stories of subtle retaliation, and pleas for guidance weighed on her heart. She remembered her conversation with Clara Simmons, who had admitted the difficulty of confronting her own ingrained prejudices. Clara's journey toward understanding was ongoing, fraught with setbacks and breakthroughs. The resistance was not just institutional, it was deeply personal. During a recent training session, Clara had broken down in tears, overwhelmed by the implications of her past actions. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she had confessed. "But I see now how my ignorance was harmful." Aaliyah understood that change required grace, not only for those harmed but also for those beginning to see. Yet, the cost of ignorance had been high. For many, it meant years of exclusion, microaggressions, and erasure. That night, as the city lights flickered, Aaliyah reflected on her own journey, the silent moments on that flight when she was mistaken for someone invisible. Those moments lingered, shaping her resolve. She reached out to Amelia Jones, her trusted ally and witness, who had become a vital voice in the movement. "Amelia," Aaliyah said during a video call, "sometimes I wonder if the silence we break is worth the personal toll." Amelia's eyes were steady. "It has to be. For every story we amplify, we open the door for healing." Their conversation was a reminder of the collective strength they shared. Meanwhile, inside Skyward Atlantic Airlines, the fallout continued. Some employees embraced the new culture, while others resisted quietly. The airline had suspended several crew members pending investigation, but whispers of fear and uncertainty remained. Derek Wallace struggled with his role, wrestling with guilt and confusion. Emily Hart considered leaving the industry altogether, feeling the pressure of public scrutiny and personal reflection. The airline's Human Resources Department was flooded with reports, requests for support, and calls for clearer policies. Aaliyah met regularly with legal counsel Mark Ellis and communications advisor Renee Bennett to navigate the complex terrain of accountability and public perception. Their discussions often circled back to one critical question: how do you sustain change without burning out the people who lead it? For Aaliyah, the answer lay in community, the network of allies, mentors, and supporters who shared the vision and carried the load. She began hosting informal gathering spaces for dialogue, rest, and renewal. These meetings became a lifeline, offering refuge and strength. One evening, after a particularly taxing day, Aaliyah shared her doubts openly with Jada Coleman. "Sometimes I fear that the cost is too high," she admitted, "that the silence we break will just be replaced by new shadows." Jada squeezed her hand gently. "You're not alone in this. The cracks you create let the light in." As the weeks passed, the Echo Silence Initiative continued to evolve. New partnerships were formed, including collaborations with mental health organizations to support employees and passengers affected by bias and discrimination. Aaliyah championed a holistic approach, one that recognized the emotional and psychological dimensions of systemic change. She also launched a mentorship program aimed at elevating voices from marginalized communities within the airline industry, creating pathways for leadership and influence. Despite the progress, challenges persisted. Some critics accused Echo Silence of being performative or politicized. Others questioned the sustainability of such comprehensive reforms. In a panel discussion at a national conference, Aaliyah addressed these critiques head-on. "Change is uncomfortable," she acknowledged. "It requires us to question long-held beliefs and face uncomfortable truths. But discomfort is the birthplace of growth." Her words resonated deeply with many but also ignited debate. The movement had become a mirror reflecting society's complexities, the intersections of race, class, power, and identity. Throughout it all, Aaliyah remained committed to listening and learning. She convened a council of advisors representing diverse perspectives to guide the ongoing development of echo silence. One advisor, a civil rights lawyer, reminded her, "Systems are made by people, and people are flawed. Our goal is not perfection, but progress." That insight grounded Aaliyah's vision. She knew the journey would be long and winding, but every step mattered. Late one night, as she prepared for a keynote address at an international symposium, Aaliyah looked out over the city skyline. The lights shimmered like stars, each representing a life touched by the movement. Her thoughts returned to the young woman who had approached her after a speech months ago, tears in her eyes, saying, "Your story gave me hope. Hope, the fragile yet powerful force sustaining the quiet revolution." Aaliyah closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was ready to walk it, not alone, but with many. Because the true power of echo silence lay not in a single voice, but in the chorus of those who chose to break their silence. The conference hall was quiet as Aaliyah Morgan stepped onto the stage one final time. The room was filled with representatives from over 100 nations, the air thick with anticipation and the weight of history in the making. This was no ordinary summit. It was the culmination of years of unseen battles, of voices long silenced now speaking with clarity and purpose. Aaliyah stood before the microphone, her calm presence commanding respect without demanding it. No slides, no scripted speeches, just the truth. She began simply, "I won't open with numbers. You've all seen them. I won't open with stories. You've all heard them." She paused, letting the silence draw attention. "Instead, I will open with a question. What are you willing to protect, even when no one is watching?" The room held its breath. Echo. Silence was never about exposing villains. She continued. It was about removing the comfort of plausible deniability, about forcing a choice between comfort and courage. She spoke of the thousands of anonymous reports that had revealed the subtle, everyday acts of bias that erode dignity and trust. She shared stories of courage flight attendants who intervened quietly but firmly, passengers who chose to speak out despite fear, employees who challenged their own biases and emerged stronger. Her voice was steady but carried an undeniable power. We did not make noise. We made a structure, a system that ensures respect is not a privilege, but a right. The audience erupted in applause, not just for her, but for the movement she represented, the quiet revolution reshaping institutions worldwide. Later, as the applause faded, Aaliyah retreated to a quiet corner. Amelia Jones approached, tablet in hand, ready with the latest reports from the global network of echo silence centers. Together, they reviewed data showing tangible improvements, decreased incidents of bias, increased reporting, and, most importantly, a culture slowly shifting toward accountability. Aaliyah smiled, not because the work was done, but because the foundations were laid. Outside the summit, the world was watching. News outlets hailed the movement as transformative. Social media buzzed with stories of change from airlines, transit systems, and workplaces adopting echo silence principles. But for Aaliyah, the real victory was quieter. It was in the small moments, a flight attendant who calmly corrected a passenger's bias, a manager who listened without judgment, a passenger who felt seen and respected for the first time. She thought back to the first flight, the napkin, the shattered phone. Those moments had ignited a movement that refused to be silenced. That evening, back in her hotel room overlooking the city, Aaliyah received a message from her mother. Simple words filled with pride and love. "The world sees you now, but I always did." Aaliyah stared at the message, then closed her eyes, breathing deeply. She knew this was not just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had chosen to break their silence, to every person who had been overlooked, dismissed, or erased. The revolution was in stillness in the choices made quietly but powerfully when no one else was watching. Aaliyah packed her bag for the journey home, not as a solitary leader but as part of a vast network of silent defenders. As she stepped into the airport terminal, she passed a young girl holding a book titled Echo Silence: The Quiet Revolution. The girl looked up and asked, "Did you write this?" Aaliyah knelt, handing her a blank notebook. "Part of it," she said softly, "but it's still being written. Want to help?" The girl nodded, eyes bright with determination, and with that, the quiet revolution continued. Not in anger, not in chaos, but in the decisions made when the world goes silent. Thank you for joining us on this journey through courage, silence, and transformation. Aaliyah's story reminds us that discrimination often hides in quiet moments, moments when someone's dignity is dismissed, erased, or ignored. But it also teaches us that true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in resilience, in quiet defiance, and in the decision to stand firm when no one else is watching. We must honor those who face prejudice with grace and strength, while calling out the systems that allow bias to persist. Every voice matters, every action counts, and every story can change the world. If this story moved you, inspire others by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Silent Defenders. Together, we will explore more untold stories of justice, respect, and the silent power that reshapes lives. Stay with us for the next video, where we uncover another story that demands to be heard, because change begins not with noise, but with those brave enough to show up. Silent Defenders, where silence is not submission, but a force for justice.